Okay, throughout the talk, I'll be using this acronym WEIRD. Stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic, and that's here on the front. You'll see what the purpose of that acronym is as we go along. All right, so the book is really built around a few different questions, so 3 questions. So the first one really came about from research I did in the 20-aughts, where I worked with 2 psychologists, Steve Heine and Ara Norenzayan. And what we were doing back then was we were putting together all the data we could find on psychological variation. And what we found when we put together, several different domains of psychology to understand what the global variation was, is we found not only was there a lot more global variation in psychology than you would typically get from reading psychology journals or behavioral economics journals, but that in fact the populations most commonly studied by psychologists and behavioral economists and others are particularly unusual in global perspective. Now, not on every dimension, but on some important dimensions that seem to have a big impact, potentially a big impact on behavior. So the first goal of the book is really to get that message out kind of clearly and take advantage of new data that's come since our 2010 review. And so here I just put a couple of measures that are common for which we can plot global measures. This first one is individualism, which I'll say more about later, but you can see that varies around the world, with places like the US and UK being the most individualistic places, also Australia. And then in-group, out-group trust, so the difference between how much you trust strangers and people you don't know versus how much you trust friends and family. And that's large and very large in some places and relatively smaller in the darker blue places here. So a difference between in and out-group trust. Now, if we're talking to economists, these are differences in beliefs and preferences that we find around the world. But if we were talking to cognitive scientists, I could show you measures of attention, memory, perception, reasoning, decision-making biases or heuristics, and reasoning styles that vary around the world. And there's, I characterize these in different ways depending on which branch of the social sciences I'm talking to. Okay, so just some cautions that I've put in to this version of the talk, because sometimes people get the wrong idea about what we're talking about. So throughout this talk, although I use this weird acronym, I use it as a consciousness-raising device to remind researchers in the social sciences and beyond that the populations most commonly studied are unusual in a global perspective. One problem with this, though, is it somehow tends to create a weird versus non-weird dichotomy. You'll notice as I go along, I'll often show distributions. These vary continuously, and they're multidimensional. So sometimes I'll just show you country level variation because that's where the data is accessible. But throughout the book, I talk about variation between villages within the same ethnic group, among ethnic groups, say among different regions within European countries, among states within the United States or Europe. So there's lots of lower level variation that we can take a look at. The other thing to remember is that this is a cultural evolutionary approach. So it's very much anti-essentializing. So it doesn't assume that culture is static. So sometimes in economics, people do assume culture is static. The whole persistence literature makes this assumption. Within my world, if you want to show that culture is stable and persistent, you need to show that in a model. You need a way of explaining why culture would be sticky and not change over time. The assumption is that culture is continuously changing. And so we can look at variations amongst individuals because we're tracking distributions. So that's how you represent culture in cultural evolutionary models. And of course, those distributions change over time. And that's the evolution part. Okay, so the first question was the interesting patterns of global variation, how people think and reason and how they feel. But the next bigger question, and what the book's really about, is trying to make an effort to explain some of that variation. So we've documented this variation. That's what cultural psychology does. And at some level, that's useful, but very much butterfly collecting. So now we have all the different kinds of butterflies, and we have to explain where those come from. Why do we get different kinds of butterflies in different places? So the idea here is that our minds have actually evolved genetically to adapt to diverse institutions. And languages and technologies. So we're a cultural species, and a large part of our genetically evolved neuroplasticity allows us to mold how we think and process information to the worlds we encounter while growing up, and then gradually over cultural evolutionary time. So this has potentially big implications for lots of things, like the functioning of formal institutions or the effectiveness of different kinds of economic or other policies, public health policies. I'm interested in the origins of the commercial revolution, which begins in Europe, say about 900, or the legal revolution, so the emergence of Western law that begins in the High Middle Ages. And then one of the main questions in economics, which really animates a lot of the book, is the question of the origins of the Industrial Revolution. And so I'll say a little bit on my second to last slide about the relationship between these ideas and the collective brain, and how that can give rise to, and how that can help us understand the Industrial Revolution. So I'm showing this common plot, which probably many of you are familiar with, showing the massive increase in income in European countries beginning in around 800 over the last 2 centuries. Now, related here, in understanding the European expansion, people often and correctly point to things like colonialism, the dispossession of native peoples from lands, the extraction of resources from around the world. That's all true and something I deal with in the book, but I think the key thing and the thing I want to contribute to is explaining how and why European populations after 1500 were able to do this in ways that, so why did the Spanish show up in Spain and take the land from the Aztecs? The Aztecs were a plenty land-hungry empire who had no problem dispossessing peoples in Mexico of land, but they didn't show up in Spain. So the question is, why didn't the Aztecs show up in Spain? All right. Okay. So broadly in the background is an evolutionary approach, and so I'm beginning with the recognition that humans are a type of ape, and that we should, a lot of what we can say about humans just to get started is recognizing that we're a type of ape. And when I talk about kin-based institutions, I'm going to take advantage of that ape heritage. But my book, The Secret of Our Success, is very much about how natural selection has shaped our minds to make us into a cultural species, much more cultural than any other ape. So we have these evolved capacities for cultural learning that allow us to acquire ideas, beliefs, and values from other members of our social group, to do it in adaptive ways, so we're more likely to get relatively more adaptive practices. And then cultural evolution, of course, is thinking about how this aggregates and changes over time as populations of individuals engage in this learning process. I have a box for other aspects of psychology, things like we have preferential altruism, we have altruism towards members of our kin group. This, of course, can be formally modeled and used to generate hypotheses about how we should learn from others. And this process of cultural evolution can be formally modeled to help us understand the emergence of complex tools, ritual practices, social norms and institutions, and in languages, increasingly complex languages. And then the idea is that psychologically we get the emergence of these cultural psychologies as our minds adapt ontogenetically, so not genetically, to the worlds that we encounter. And so we already have evidence that this alters our visual processing, can affect our ability to make visual judgments, the perceptions of visual illusions. Things like self-regulation or patience can be affected by things like religious rituals. Pro-social motivations, we acquire and internalize social norms, so that can affect our social behavior. Acquiring number systems can affect our ability to think about numbers, and spatial cognition is embedded in different languages in different ways. So those are just some examples of the ways in which culturally evolved products shape our minds ontogenetically. Now, I don't not spend any time on this during this talk, but if you look at the book kind of opens with an example of how culture shapes our brains biologically but not genetically. And a simple example is reading. So when you learn to read as a child, you get a thicker corpus callosum, you get some specialized circuitry in your left ventral hemisphere that's actually specialized for reading. And at least one idea, which, of course there's debate about this in the neuroscience community, but one idea is that it actually drives out and uses up some of the neurogeographic space in our brains that's otherwise used for face processing. So readers, literate populations, are worse at face processing than other populations, and we're right hemisphere biased in facial processing in a way that non-literate populations, those that characterize most of human history, were probably not so right hemisphere biased in visual processing. So it changes the brain as a consequence of learning. And then, of course, the secret of our success is about the deeper process where the cultural products shaped our genetic evolution over long periods of time. But that's not what we're focusing on today. Okay, so zooming in on norms and institutions, norms actually evolve spontaneously or arise spontaneously as an emergent product of cultural learning. So once learners are learning the proper behavior, they're acquiring behaviors from others, and then they're acquiring the rules for judging others on those behaviors, you can get these self-reinforcing equilibria, stable states, in which most people in a social group are doing the same thing, and they're judging each other in similar ways, and then it creates a sticky social norm. Okay, so this is relevant for how economists, I know some of you are economists, think about culture and institutions, and this is often presented as a kind of dichotomy, and I think that's a really hindrance to making progress on these ideas. So from this point of view, institutions are constructed by culturally evolved social norms. So take something like marriage. It's governed by a series of social norms about who you can marry, where you can live after marriage, what the responsibilities are of the people in the marriage, those kinds of things. And if we have a collection of those, we have the institution of marriage. And we're cobbling up here from sort of basic aspects of psychology like cultural learning to get to something like institutions. So it's not culture or institutions, it's institutions as a consequence of culture. And now formal institutions just emerge when we have institutions for making group decisions like political institutions, but that's just a set of norms about how to make decisions. And these can be formalized in law and constitutions and writing. So there you get something that looks more like a formal institution. Okay. All right, so probably the first institution we encounter in the world, and probably the first ones that humans ever created, are kin-based institutions. And the reason I say that is some human societies really only have kin-based institutions, and these kin-based institutions govern politics, production, distribution, all the kinds of things where other societies rely on a larger number of institutions. And these are built on features we share with other apes. So our kin psychology, this is why parents love their children, and why brothers and sisters tend to cooperate, rooted in our tendency to bestow help preferentially on genealogical relatives. Well, what cultural evolution has done is harness that and extend it into these wider networks. So in lots of societies, there's a group of cousins that you call brother and sister, and that the norm says that you have to treat them like brothers and sisters, and that gives you roles and responsibilities towards them. There's often another set of cousins that are preferred marriage partners, and so those are people you're encouraged to marry or you're required to marry, and that builds new bonds between social groups. Pair bonding, so we share with gorillas this inclination to pair bond to form long-term bonds between males and females for the purposes of rearing children. So it creates affines. And of course, humans wrap a bunch of norms around that, which help increase the longevity of these pair bonds and regulate them in all kinds of interesting ways. And this helps build larger groups. And then also incest aversion. So like other primates, we have to deal with inbreeding. So humans have an innate incest aversion to sex with close relatives, siblings or parents. But then culture extends these into incest taboos. And incest taboos are most prevalent and strongest. People don't worry too much about sex among siblings because it's so rare. They worry about sex with first cousins because often those are classificatory siblings, and that's where the taboo really kicks in. Or uncles, things like that. Okay, so this affects the basic structure of human social networks that endures through time. Okay, now just putting a very, very glossy kind of high-level picture on this over the last 10,000 years or so. So before the emergence of agriculture, 10,000 years ago, humans lived in relatively mobile hunter-gatherer bands with what anthropologists call extensive kinship. So it's all kin-based society, except people are building bonds or not marrying their cousins, and they're building bonds with people far away. And that's giving them advantages when shocks hit or something and your water hole dries up. You need to go find some connections further away. Reciprocity and ritual are also used for that. But then as agriculture begins to spread, people need to have greater command and control, more cooperation to control swaths of territory. So they begin to scale up and alter the basic kin-based institutions. So you get the emergence of unilineal clans, so patrilineal or matrilineal clans. You get norms of common ownership. That means everybody partakes in owning land and it descends from one generation to the next. Notions of inherited status, so command and control depends on your position in the kinship unit, your age and sex, and things like ancestor worship pop up. So they basically change some of the rules about kinship, but still harnessing the same instincts that I mentioned earlier. And then there's lots of different ways that this has emerged to make even more complex societies. So some societies have age sets, some have segmentary lineages, and some have simple chiefdoms where you begin to see differences in authority between some clans and other clans. And this seems to be, archaeologists and anthropologists have proposed, the major pathway to pre-modern states. So in complex chiefdoms, you get the first stratification. So there are some clans who are elites and they don't intermarry with the lower clans. So you have a separation there, which really begins with a rule about who you can have sex with, or at least who you can marry. And then eventually it becomes a state when you get bureaucracy, which I'll say more about that in a second. Okay. Now, there's lots of other kinds of societies that have prestige-based leadership, but this one is interesting because this seems to be the pathway to states, and that's going to be important. Okay, so just a little bit on pre-modern states. So these emerged from these chiefdoms. So these were the elite clans, and these are the not elite clans, often conquered populations. And then the state institutions begin to emerge. This becomes a state when you get military, financial, religious, or judicial institutions that are more impersonal. They're not built on the idiom of kinship and often mediate between the elite strata and the lower strata. But it's still in the elites and at the lower strata you have people, kinship is the basic unit of production. People rely on these kin for a social safety net. There's lots of arranged marriage. There's notions of corporate responsibility. So if your cousin, brother does something, that can affect you and you have to take responsibility for that. And people get their personal identity from these kin networks. Now, my argument in the book is that this doesn't provide a clean pathway to modern secular institutions, the kind of impersonal institutions that dominate our world today. So there was something happened in Europe to kind of unhinge this and allow that pathway to emerge. Now, to get there, I'm going to actually focus on weird psychology and try to explain how it is we got these patterns of psychology. Now, in the account laid out in the book here, I'm just going to give you a high-level overview. In my account, what leads to the evolution of these secular institutions, but also of this weirder psychology, begins with one particular branch of Christianity. So not Christianity in general. What's interesting here is it's just this one branch. The Western Church, the one that eventually becomes the Roman Catholic Church, begins to promote a set of policies that actually tear apart the complex kin-based institutions of Western Europe and breaks it down into monogamous nuclear families. This takes centuries and is only complete in some parts of Europe by around 1,000 and then another 500 years probably in a larger swath of Europe. But it's an ongoing process. And so I'm going to show you a little bit of evidence about this one, and then I'll probably spend more time on this green arrow. But this process continued. So the argument in the book is that once you break down into nuclear families, people need to replace the functions traditionally done by kin-based institutions. And with this weirder psychology, they start to build voluntary associations. So in the High Middle Ages, you get guilds, monasteries, charter towns, and universities, where people can join. There's certain rules about membership and behavior. You have responsibilities to other members of your group, and they begin competing. So that leads to competition amongst voluntary associations. And I think this has an independent effect on weird psychology, and I have a whole chapter of evidence on that. And then that leads to greater urbanization. So Europe's not urbanized in 800 or 900, but by the time you get to 1200, Western Europe is passing China, and then after 1500 it passes the Islamic world in terms of the number of people who live in cities. Crucially, in these cities, there's a degree of free occupational choice where people can become a bread maker or a clock maker and choose different occupations, and I think that has an effect on weird psychology. So urbanization and occupational choice. And then I talk about markets, which I'll say a little bit about today, assuming we get time, the way that markets affect psychology. And then finally, I make the case that this transformation of psychology eventually leads to things at the national level, like the emergence of representative government, so think Glorious Revolution, or the emergence of this peculiar package of religions, Protestantism, where people are obsessed with mental states. One of the things I try to explain is why Protestantism is so obsessed with mental states. And then, of course, high amounts of innovation, which I know some of you are interested in, things like financial markets and economic growth. So I'll kind of close that loop towards the end of the talk. Okay. All right, so just to give you a sense, I've talked a lot about kinship, and probably a lot of audiences that I talk to are kind of confused about, well, what's all this talk about kinship? Families just aren't very important in our society. Oh, is there a question? I see a hand.
Yeah, I do have sort of a comment or question for you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this book called Inventing the Individual, or like basically how liberalism became a thing in Europe. So basically, the argument of the book is that basically religion switch basically the focus from like a group of individuals or how they cooperated into something individual, because at the end salvation is something that you achieve for yourself. That's sort of like the argument that the book makes. So I wanted to understand exactly the link at the beginning of in your previous slide, where you started with sort of the role of the church in order to explain sort of some of the developments, and I guess that more concretely, I want to know your take on the role of religion, sort of moving us ourselves into a more cooperative sort of a society, or more individualistic, as the sort of the hypothesis of the book that I mentioned.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with that book. And in my book, the chapter right before the one I'm talking about now, the chapter on kinship, is actually all about religion, and it makes the point that there are these moralizing religions. So includes Christianity, Islam, and religions like Hinduism and Buddhism are also moralizing religions, and they do a bunch of work that favor cooperation, and I've studied those in other lines of work. But here we're trying to figure out what went on in Western Europe. And so Christianity is a constant across lots of places. So Christianity can't help you with that. And so in all the analyses, I'm going to show you a lot of regression analyses. We always compare the same religious denomination. So we compare Catholics and Catholics and Protestant and Protestant. So I don't think that's playing a role, although what I argue in the book is in the background of all this are moralizing religions. It's just that what happened interestingly in this one particular brand of Christianity was that it began to monkey around with the family in particular ways. Now, other religions were doing that. So Zoroastrianism, which is also a moralizing religion, also monkeyed around with the family, but it encouraged incestuous marriage and had elites marrying brothers and sisters, encouraged lots of cousin marriage. So different religions were doing different things. And the idea is that there's some amount of random variation in this, and this is the particular group that got a certain combination of marriage and family practices. Does that make sense?
I have one clarifying question.
Yeah.
So between slides 9 and 10, it seemed like we changed the time scale of the dynamic process underlying what's going on. Because first, maybe a few slides before that, because we went from kind of the scale of genetic evolution, which I would just imagine progresses at over like hundreds of generations, to now the evolution of social institutions, which progresses much more rapidly. You want to just say something about how we connect the speed at which things evolve from at the genetic level versus at the social level?
Let's see. So, I really kind of left genetic evolution on this slide, which in The Secret of Our Success is operating on timescales of tens of thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years or more. Once I get to this slide, I'm focused on cultural evolution at this point and thinking of these institutions as evolving through cultural evolution. And so this is, it's a pretty big span of time, thousands of years here. And the point of this is just that there were lots of states around the world in, say take a year 1000 in the Common Era. The world's covered with lots of states, but my argument is that those were of this particular kind of state, where they're characterized by lots of intensive kinship at the lower levels, but also at the elite level. And what began interestingly to happen in Western Europe was the church, unconsciously essentially, started to dissolve the kin bonds that held together the lower strata and the elite strata. So yeah, does that help?
It does. When you were talking about kinship groups, we were still including other apes. And even with having an elite strata, I don't know if that ever is observed among other apes. So there was just some confusion there about when what do we get out of the genetics that underlies the processes?
Oh yeah, so that's really important. All the point of this was just that humans have an evolved psychology that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years deep into our evolutionary history that includes this. So you can't really understand human societies without recognizing, I mean, why are there parents and children, right? Why don't we just randomly distribute our children? People have tried that, it doesn't work. So, we have these bonds to close genetic relatives. We have this pair bonding, which is why marriage is a near universal. And we have this incest aversion stuff, which there's quite a bit of research on. And these are the anchors or the primitives from which cultural evolution organizes the rest of the social structure through social norms. Okay? All right, let's see here. We're here. Okay, so weird families. So if you just go to the Ethnographic Atlas, which is a database of anthropological societies around 1200 or so, and you pick out some traits. So bilateral inheritance are what many of us are accustomed to. So tracking descent through both mom and dad. And only a minority of societies do that, so 28%. Most societies don't do bilateral inheritance. Little or no cousin marriage. Most societies have some substantial cousin marriage, so 75%. Monogamous marriage is rare, so most societies allow elite and high-status men to take additional wives. Nuclear families are even more rare, so there's usually extended family households of some kind. And neolocal residence, where the bride and the groom live separate from either family, is even more rare. If you add these up, most societies have zero, so this is just over 50% have zero of these weird kinship traits. And you can go down fewer and fewer and fewer, and down here, if you actually look at the societies that are in the Atlas here, they're mostly Christianized societies or European descent societies. So like French Canadians are in here, the Irish are in here, or places like the Philippines and Cebu, where Magellan lands in 1521 and starts complaining about the polygyny that he finds. And they were monogamous by the time the anthropologists arrived to make the recording. So anyway, the point is that families have been very different historically and cross-culturally than what many of us are familiar with, and sort of much more important. So this is a sensible place to think that if institutions are going to shape our psychology, it would be in families where these are the first institutions that humans encounter when they enter the world. So thinking about children and babies, and that's the first world they have to navigate. All right, just to give you an intuitive sense of what I have in mind here, is that if you think of navigating or adapting to life in a society with intensive kin-based institutions or weak kin-based institutions, in one place you get most of your relationships at birth, and there's a limited range for creating new relationships. In the other world, you have mostly your nuclear family relationships, and you've got to figure out your friends and your mates and your business partners and all that kind of stuff in a kind of marketplace for relationships. Here, there's a lot of incentives to conform to the roles and privileges and obligations that come along with these culturally, normatively defined relationships you have with lots of other people. And here you need to cultivate a set of desirable dispositions in order to attract spouses, partners, friends, all those kinds of things, something that sets you apart and would make people want to be your friend. Here you're going to seek out new relationships through your existing network connections. So what makes someone trustworthy is that they're embedded in your network. In this world, you don't have much in the way of networks usually for lots of things. So you're looking for people who are dispositionally trusting, that seem like a trustworthy person in some kind of internal sense. Weird people are big on dispositional thinking. That's something that cultural psychologists have shown. So a big difference between shame and guilt, living up to the standards of the society versus living up to personal standards. And here your identity is embedded in and derives from your relationships and your networks, your clan, your ethnic group. And here it's these individual self-attributes. You're a kayaker, a scientist, something like that. Okay, so how and when did this happen? So I make the case that it was due to the church's marriage and family program, and that it begins, or one of the things that it contains are incest taboos. So the church begins banning cousin marriage, beginning with first cousins, and eventually going out to sixth cousins in the 11th century. Now it's brought back to fourth cousins, and the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 includes up to third cousins. Now these things have imprinted themselves on contemporary culture. So if you're at a Catholic wedding, or some Protestant denominations have adopted this as well, there's a moment at which the preacher or minister will say something like, here, does anyone here have an objection to the joining of this couple in holy matrimony? Speak now or forever hold your peace. And that's actually from an incest inquest developed in the Carolingian Empire, in which it was a last chance. You bring everyone together and you say, let's just verify that this couple isn't related. And there was incentives for people to speak out if they thought the couple were related. Mainly, they could get in trouble if they were found to have known later on. The other place where this program pops up is in the English term in-law, which is always a very strange in-law. I was puzzled about it as a native English speaker, and didn't, until I started working on this stuff in about 2008, I didn't know that the phrase in-law came from in canon law. So it's a reminder to people that she's your sister in canon law, which means no sex or marriage. In lots of places, she'd be a preferred marriage partner. If your wife dies, you would marry the sister. But not when she's deemed as a affine, as a sister-in-law. Also, polygynous marriage gets banned, along with the prohibition on sex slaves. The church begins to fight against arranged marriages. The ceremonial I do that brides get to do, very uncommon cross-culturally, is actually part of this. It's a last check by the minister or priest to see if it's a marriage by choice. The church works to dissolve the corporate ownership of land. It wants to tie land to the individual, because the church wants the individual to be able to give land to the church at their death. So it encourages individual testament and tries to get rid of automatic inheritance norms. This process begins in late antiquity, and by 1500, the statistical data makes clear that there's a European marriage pattern, that there's a distinct pattern of marriage that you don't see in other places, characterized by monogamy, nuclear households, that sort of thing. Okay, so in the book I have these tables just showing that there's all these different synods and efforts to ban cousin marriage of various kinds, second cousins to stepdaughters, all kinds of things. And then there's penalties, and the penalties get worse and worse through time. So this goes all the way up. This is early Middle Ages, and then to the High Middle Ages. There's the Fourth Lateran Council, when they actually contract the circle of incestuous marriage. And so basically, until 1215, you get an expansion of the prohibited circle of relatives, including affines, and stronger punishments as you go along. Okay, so empirically, to test this, what my colleagues and I did in a science paper, which I'll show you in a second, we have to be able to show that there's a relationship between the medieval church and these kin-based institutions. And we need to be able to link those kin-based institutions to aspects of weird psychology. And then finally, we should be able to make this arrow too. We should be able to show that different histories underneath the church are associated with different features of psychology. So we did this in a few different ways. One is we went to the ethnographic atlas that I mentioned, and we created an index of kinship intensity. And then by putting that together with a language database of the world's languages, we can map the world in terms of kinship intensity. Fortunately, at the same time we were doing this, my colleague Ben Anke in economics was pursuing a similar enterprise, not completely independently, but at least partially independently. And his kinship intensity index is not the same as ours, but you get the same answer essentially in the end. It's conceptually the same. We also gathered cousin marriage data and from actual cousin marriages. So this gets us kind of more what's happening on the ground as opposed to this, which is anthropological reports. And then we also use dispensation requests in Europe. And then finally, we look at the amount of time that different populations have been under the Western Church. And what we got to do is show that greater exposure to the church or less kinship intensity leads to greater individualism and independence, less conformity and obedience, greater impersonal prosociality or trust in strangers, less of a particularistic or relational morality, and greater use of intentionality and moral judgments. Those are just some examples. There's actually a lot more in the book. And then we use all kinds of different measurements to get at that. All right, that's the science paper I mentioned, Jonathan Schultz, Duman Barani Rod, and Jonathan Beauchamp. I'm going to show you some cross-national analyses just to show that the broad patterns that we see around the world are consistent with this idea. Then we're going to zoom in on Europe and take advantage of variation within countries. I'll show you a little bit of second-generation immigrant data, and then we'll look at Italy. All right, so the individualism complex is, the way I think of it, it's a set of interrelated features of psychology that psychologists and others, anthropologists, have been talking about for a long time. They may or may not be kind of linked psychologically. They may some of them may be just a product of convergent cultural evolutionary processes that are kind of pulling them together. So I don't think we have a good answer to that question. But way back in the early 70s, the anthropologist Clifford Geertz remarks on some of their variation that he's seen around the world by saying that the Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, and more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's culture. And what he means is this way we think of the unitary self with certain characteristics. People in the West will be looking for their true self or things like that, which is not something that makes sense in a lot of places or seems a bit silly in some places. So this is a focus on yourself, on cultivating those unique attributes, those dispositional traits like trustworthiness, the atomic view of the self, a lot of guilt relative to shame, overconfidence in one's valued abilities, and self-enhancement. So a tendency to put oneself forward. Overconfidence is just interesting because people are more likely to, they are less accurate in their own abilities on certain domains. Okay, so this is just a measure of individualism from Geert Hofstede, the social psychologist. This has been used in economics a lot, this measure. So greater kinship intensity is associated with less individualism. We can also measure this by using just the cousin marriage rates. So these are two efforts to measure the same thing, the kinship intensity index and cousin marriage. And we also show the negative relationship there. More cousin marriage is associated with less individualism. Here we can use a battery of cross-national controls, just trying to test the robustness of the correlation. So you guys, many of you are from, I don't know what's going on with my slides here, they keep jumping around, but many of you are probably familiar with these variables, things like caloric suitability, latitude, tropical climate, pathogen stress, genetic heterogeneity, time since the Neolithic transition, the ecological irrigation potential, religiosity, and religious denomination. And these correlations hold if you explore those controls. The number of years under the church, so we have this measure for the Eastern Church and for the Western Church. And what we find is more centuries underneath the Western Church or Eastern Church means more individualism. And what we find is we always get kind of a weak effect for the Eastern Church, which I think makes sense because the Eastern Church had kind of MFP light, and they had more trouble implementing it or implemented it less enthusiastically. Some of the policies they adopted were different. So whenever we have the data for the Eastern Church, which we don't always, we get a kind of weaker effect like this and a strong effect for the Western Church. Asch conformity measure. This is an experimental measure from social psychology that's classic textbook material. And it measures people's tendency to go along with their peers. So the percentage of errors are really the percentage of times that people intentionally make an error in the visual judgment of these lines that matches their peers. And so greater kinship intensity shows more conformity, more cousin marriage, greater conformity, and more centuries under the church, less conformity. So you get the same basic pattern there. It's a small data set, so no controls on this one. All right, now I just want to briefly take a side look here, because one of the kind of feedback or things I'm learning is that when you give people information like this, they have a tendency to balance the traits. So you have people have an immediate reaction that conformity is good or conformity is bad. And what I think is important to point out is that the idea behind all this is that our minds are adapting to the affordances and incentives and constraints of the institutions we're adapting to. So, and then what we find is that whether people think conformity is a good thing really depends on where you are. So Americans often think calling someone a conformist is kind of an insult, but in lots of places it's a compliment. And Christine Laguerre, a developmental psychologist, actually did some detailed research on this. And she showed parents in Vanuatu, in the South Pacific, videos of children who were either being conformists or not conformists. And the parents all thought, the Vanuatu parents thought the kids who copied really well and did exactly what they were, or copied the thing they were being shown exactly, were smarter. Like, with the appropriate translation, and in some sense behaving better when they were conformists. Whereas the Texan parents, that was there, she did the study in Texas, they like the nonconformist kids, the kids who were deviating from what they were being shown. So whether conformity is balanced good or bad just depends on where you're from, and I think it will go along with the affordances of your institutions. Okay. So this is a public goods game. So standard public goods game, experimental game done with undergraduates. So more kinship intensity means less cooperation in the first round of the public goods game. This was done by Benedict Herman, Simon Gexter, and Christian Thoney in 2008. And so the first round is interesting because it's before anybody gets any feedback from the game. You get the same thing with cousin marriage, and with church exposure you get higher contributions, cooperative contributions. And there's the Western Church and there's the Eastern Church. Now it's interesting because you actually exaggerate these effects if you look at the effects of punishment. So in societies with low kinship intensity, if you add punishment to a public goods game, it drives up cooperation. If you add punishment in a society with high kinship intensity, people start punishing back, and that you don't get any of the cooperation-inducing effects of punishment. Oftentimes, the cooperation will go nowhere because there's just punishment and counter-punishment, and total payoffs go back. So that's important for thinking about policy, because I mean, in some sense, you can think of pure punishment as a policy intervention, and you get different effects in different places depending on what the culture is of the people, right? And in this case, the kinship structure.
Joe, may I ask a question?
Yeah.
The issue of Eastern Church and Western Church, it's always a characteristic of a place. It's not religious adherence of the participants, right?
Right. So in this particular study, we didn't do it, but in lots of the studies, we can look at that and we can hold constant, the majority religious denomination and the average religiosity of the population. Yeah. So it's actually a feature of the population how long that population has been under the domain of the church.
Right. I know that church exposure is much longer than socialism or communism, but I wonder whether some of this is also due to the overlap between the Eastern Church and socialist or communist.
Yeah, great question. I think the best way to address that is I'm going to zoom in on Europe in a second, and we'll take a look at the East and the West.
Also on the Western Church issue, it seems odd to talk about social values and religion and not discuss a distinction between Catholicism and Protestantism. You must have opinions on this. I'm thinking of Robert Woodbury's work on the role of Protestant missionaries in spreading democratic values. How does that distinction fit in?
Well, it's central to the book. So the thing about Protestantism, it's the thing to be explained, not the thing that does the explaining. So what I try to do in the book is explain how you could ever get to a world where a religion as individualistic and unusual as Protestantism could even emerge. So part of what I'm trying to do is set the groundwork for the emergence of Protestantism. And then in the later chapters in the book, I show that Protestantism has independent psychological effects over and above the church effects. So for example, something like hard work or thrift or something like that, you get extra effects if you take not only the church, but you also look at whether people are Protestants. So I think that is important.
But if you just help me fill in one piece in the logic, because we were drawing this back to canon law that was pre-1500. And so it seems like there were a lot of things set in motion that would have operated before the rise of Protestantism. And so can you consummate some of those things without the Protestant Reformation? We get a separate effect of just of Catholic versus Protestantism, understanding there's an endogeneity here?
Well, so, I mean, if you look at, so this is getting into some of the details in the book, which I don't have here, but for a lot of those studies, I just looked at things like Germany. And I didn't do it. I cited work that just looked at places like Germany, where you had different regions of Germany getting put under Protestantism after the Peace at Augsburg, or put under Catholicism, and then looking at how that predicts contemporary behavior, whether it's something like work hours or responses on surveys that's meant to capture patients or something like that. Is that?
But I guess just in thinking about the regression lines, we've got a number of Catholic countries that are kind of showing up as not that dissimilar from some Protestant countries, and with those two groups being quite dissimilar from places that had no exposure to the Western Church. So I guess I'm
I'm not sure which analyses you're thinking of, but it is true that there is a non-zero coefficient on if you put in Protestantism, but you still get the church effect. So.
Could I
maybe
also
let me roll out some more information here, and then we can return to that. Okay, so anonymous voluntary blood donations, just showing that you see the basic pattern around the world. So this is kind of like helping strangers or something, because you're giving blood donations, and it's a public good. So higher kinship intensity, fewer voluntary blood donations. More cousin marriage, fewer, and then greater exposure to the church. You get many more blood donations, and you get that weaker effect for the Eastern Church. In this case, we have lots of data, so we can include all these. So in this case, we're including denominations. So when we compare Protestants with Protestants, we can show the effects of cousin marriage or church exposure, or the kinship intensity index. Also controls for religiosity. So this is a laboratory experiment, so I'm tacking back and forth for different kinds of data here. And so there are advantages to things like the blood donations data, because it's real world and involves a real decision, but there's lots of uncontrolled variation there. So then here we can go into a simple laboratory study. And this is done by Jonathan Schultz in 15 populations around the world. And here participants came into the laboratory, and they had to roll this dice twice and report the first roll into this computer screen, and they would get paid according to their roll. So it increases until you get to 5, and then at 6 you get 0. So if people report honestly, you should get, so this is the percentage of high claim, so this is rolls of 3, 4, or 5. And you should, if people are reporting honestly, you should get 50%. So everybody lies, misreports on these dice rolls. But in correlation with corruption measures at the country level, you find that some populations misreport more than others. And so if you take a look at this from the kinship intensity point of view, higher kinship intensity leads to more misreporting, same story with cousin marriage, and the usual story with church exposure. So again, broad patterns, lots of different kinds of evidence, telling roughly the same story. And I'll just throw out this last one. So these are we took this data from Ray Fishman, and Ted Miguel. So these are these diplomatic parking tickets in the 1990s and early 2000s. And so it's kind of a measure of impersonal honesty, similar to the previous laboratory experiment. But here you find that higher levels of kinship intensity are associated with more unpaid parking tickets, same story with cousin marriage, and the usual story with church exposure. So Western Church means many less, and then what Eastern Church means a weaker effect. And again, here we have lots of data, so we can do all these controls. Okay, so that's just meant to be a broad picture. This is if we combine all 17 of our psychological measures and just do it. So, we can link centuries under the church to low cousin marriage rates. We can link cousin marriage rates to this impersonal, individualistic impersonal psychology. And then we can go directly from the time under the church to weird psychology. And again, seeing that same Eastern Western Church breakout. And again, this is just combining all the data.
Hey, Joe,
okay.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a question? I think
Please.
This might be a good point for it. One of the things I'm really intrigued by is the idea that this individualistic impersonal psychology might be beneficial in certain circumstances and not in others, right? And so when everyone around me is sort of kin-based or highly reciprocal, or when institutions are weak and won't enforce the contracts, then it might be quite bad to have this psychology. And I think you talk a bunch about this in the book, but I'm just curious to get your thoughts, because I'm starting research on the social norms of India's 5,000 different castes and tribes and different communities. And one of the things that's so striking is that there's so much variation at the local level. both in institutions across space, but like really across communities who are really like living right next to each other. And so I'm just curious to get your thoughts on how kind of beneficial you think these norms are in different contexts where the institutions and the people surrounding you might be very, very different.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I tried to emphasize that a little bit with my conformity discussion. But if you need to, the idea here is that your psychology needs to match the institutions, and if you're in a mismatch, you're going to lose. So if you're particularly trusting of strangers, and you're in a place where people don't trust strangers and tend to exploit strangers as prey, then that's not going to go well for you. Yeah, so and then of course in the kinds of situations you're thinking of, you're going to have all kinds of interesting mismatches where people are going to not want to interact because they're likely to end up with some kind of miscoordination or normative violation or something like that.
Thanks.
Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I just gave you was just a broad kind of global overview. The kind of more serious stuff is here, where we look at the Western Church's expansion. And here we take every bishopric and we give it a GPS location and the year at which it was created. And that allows us to assign for the circumference, we did 100 kilometers, around each of those bishoprics, a dosage, how long that area of land, the populations on that land, were under the Western Church. And you'll see sometimes these turn gray. That means that bishopric, although it existed, wasn't underneath the papal umbrella during that period. So you'll see southern Italy is often gray, Sicily, southern Spain, places like that. Okay, so if you add up all those dosages, you get this kind of variation around. Here you can see we have the Carolingian Empire in blue, and then the Iron Curtain here is in green. And we put this into our analysis, and eventually what we did is we can put it as a control, but I think even more persuasively, we just take the countries of Eastern Europe that are on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and we analyze just them, and we show the same effects there. So we can remove the effect of the curtain by just analyzing one side of it. Important is going to be that southern Italy, so the Carolingian Empire, only reaches down to here, so this is not under it, and not out to here. And so the Carolingian Empire is key because they were particularly enthusiastic about enforcing the Church's marriage and family program. Okay, so we went to the European Social Survey and grabbed 4 different psychological measures. So conformity and obedience, we use 4 questions, just simple things like he or she wants to avoid doing anything people would say is wrong. A measure of individualism independence, using 2 questions. So it's things like, it is important to him or her to make his or her own decisions about what he or she does. She likes to be free and not depend on others. And then impersonal fairness, just asking about whether people are fair, and then the generalized trust question. So people get answered from 0 to 10. So this just gives you a quick snapshot of the results. So more time under the Western Church leads to higher measures of generalized trust, generalized fairness, less conformity and obedience, and more individualism. In independence, we have our baseline geographic controls. We add additional controls, geographic controls here. We can include Roman roads in the Carolingian Empire, the presence of certain monasteries and universities. Here we include religiosity and religious denomination. And then we have income, employment, and education here. And then population density in 500, which gives us a measure of how wealthy that area was. Okay. So that's going directly to psychology. We can also use the Western Church exposure to predict the frequency of cousin marriage in different regions of Europe. We don't have great data on that, so we only have data from 68 regions of Europe. Excuse me. But we can also go directly to psychology. So just to show you the bivariates, if we look at the prevalence of cousin marriage in 20th century Europe, we can link that to our survey measures of psychology. So places where there were more cousin marriage show less individualism, more conformity and obedience, less trust, and less fairness. Here we have data only from Italy, Spain, and France, but then we also included Turkey. And you can see that Turkey is always, they have high cousin marriage in Turkey. These are different parts of Turkey. And you can see they ride the end of the distributions here in this case. So this is kind of interesting because Turkey obviously has quite a different history than Italy, France, and Spain, But once you know the cousin marriage, you can do pretty well in predicting how much of these aspects of psychology they're going to have. Okay, so finally I'll mention the second generation immigrant stuff we did. So many of you are probably familiar with this, but you have a couple who migrates into some European country, and then they have children. These are second generation immigrants, and those second generation immigrants grow up entirely in the European country, and then they take the European Social Survey. So we can assign those kids, now adults taking the survey, measures of either the kinship intensity index, the cousin marriage, or the church duration for their home, either the home country or the home ethno-linguistic group. And then we can see if we can predict the behavior of second generation immigrants living in the same country. So this is always country fixed effects, so only comparing people in the same country. And we find, we can do this using the mother, the father, or we can average the mother and father. So what I'm just showing you here is just using mom. She's the strongest, she's stronger than dad. So when mom comes from a country with higher KII, the offspring raised in Europe has lower trust. And the same, you get the usual pattern with fairness, lower fairness, higher conformity based on the KII, and less individualism. Just highlighting this because this allows us to control for fixed effects for the mother's country. So taking advantage of the fact that there's multiple ethnicities in each country, so we can hold the origin country constant. And you get basically the same answer. And this holds when we control for things like the feeling of being discriminated against, the education, and income. So it's not an income effect or anything. Okay. All right, so zooming in even further, we can take a look at Italy here. So Italy is interesting because, of course, northern Italy has a very different history than southern Italy. Northern Italy is famous for the Renaissance and the banking industry, and southern Italy is famous for things like the mafia and for tight social ties, I guess. And so that's the cousin marriage rates across Italy's 93 provinces, and these are blood donations, so voluntary anonymous blood donations for the 93 provinces. And I can show you analyses, I'll show you plots in a second, showing that higher cousin marriage is associated with fewer voluntary blood donations, more corruption, less impersonal trust, measured in a few different ways. So more loans from banks, more loans from friends and not banks, and people keep more wealth in cash and fewer checks, which we take to be a measure of impersonal trust. And if I show you the plots, so greater cousin marriage across the 93 provinces, fewer blood donations, or greater cousin marriage, more wealth kept in cash, which again we think is a measure of impersonal trust. We can put these into a regression framework and hold individual income, wealth, and education constant, control for other aspects of geography. We can even use smaller regions and put in fixed effects for smaller regions of Italy, and you get the same effect. Okay. So I just, one of the reasons that I think that the Italy data and also the European data more generally is important is because it really dissolves any essentialized notions of culture. So here we're explaining differences among Italians by knowing something about the history and the social structure, history and or social structure of Italy's 93 provinces. And so we see that there's no sense in which there's a European culture or some kind of a centralized, historically deep European culture, because we can, we're looking at people in the same country and explaining differences between them based on the details of the history of each of those regions. And the variation is continuous and relatively recent, at least to an evolutionary biologist, so last 1,000 years. And in the book, I perform a similar exercise by looking at China and India and showing how you can explain variation among provinces in China or states in Italy by knowing something about the ecology and how that affects the social structure. So Jonathan Schultz and Max Winkler and I are doing this in the US now. Okay, so back to my big picture sketch here, what we're up to. Let me just take a few minutes and talk about these links in the puzzle. So the idea, as you'll recall, was that with the breakdown of the kinship structures, people began to form new institutions, and these included voluntary institutions. Key in those voluntary institutions were charter towns. So after about 900,000, there was a lot of rural-urban migration, and new towns began to spring up in many parts of Europe. And so that leads to greater urbanization and to the rise of impersonal markets. As there begins to be a lot of trade, this is labeled by historians as the commercial revolution. So lots of merchants. So just to give you a sense, this is urbanization rates with new, there's free cities emerging, there's charter towns, and we're getting upward by 1,500, 8-9% urbanization. At the same time, we have lots of new markets. So these are city incorporations here, so new cities being started, and people need grants when they're going to hold a market. So this is like a market day where all the people in the rural areas come to town and they all do trading in the town. So that gives us a measure of how much market integration there is. And you can see during the Middle Ages here, there's quite an increase in the number of market grants. So it's not too far of an inference to assume people are becoming more market integrated. Now this is interesting because work in the contemporary world has looked at the relationship between market integration and people's impersonal prosociality. So I've done some work on that, showing some correlations based on data from around the world, but I really like this study by Devish Rashtagi. So what Devish did is he worked among the Bale Oromo in Ethiopia. And these are pastoralists. They traditionally live in patrilineal clans. They have these villages that are along the northern slope of the Bale Mountains, and they live in age sets. And so this is 53 different villages that vary in travel time to the market from 5 hours down here at these villages to 30 minutes at these villages. And Devish did a public goods game where he measured people's willingness to engage in conditional cooperation. So if someone else is going to give a lot to the public good, then you're going to give a lot to the public good. And so what he finds is that the closer these communities are to the market, the more willing they are to engage in this conditional cooperation with anonymous others. I think anonymous others is an important part of this. And he argues that this is exogenous because people are sort of anchored in these villages, and so there's no sense in which the more people with greater impersonal prosociality are somehow moving to the closer to the market. The markets actually pop up historically later than the villages. Okay, and the other thing that Devish does that's interesting is he shows this link from markets to impersonal prosociality measured by experiments. But then he shows that this impersonal prosociality is associated with the formation of and implementation of impartial rules. So this was all part of a project to understand forest conservation. So the communities got together and they agreed to not cut down trees, for example, that were thinner than a certain degree. So not to do kind of illegal logging. And he shows that those are more effective. So the places with this higher impersonal prosociality, they form associations, and those associations implement more effectively the rules that help conserve the forest. And you ended up with objectively better, healthier forests around these communities. So. Now, what's interesting, then you can zoom back to a historical perspective. If you look at 14th century England, markets had been popping up all over England for a few centuries at that point. So most people, even rural farmers, were within a 2 hours walk of a market. 90%, some historians have argued, were within 3 hours walk of a market. If you then map that to this, it means that the whole English population, or 90% of them, were in this part of the curve, which means it's going to be a lot easier to build voluntary associations if you're in this part of the curve. You've been affected by markets. And the other thing that I draw on in the book, which I don't have time to do here, which is kind of fun, is there are these ethnographic observers who are kind of observing this process as it plays out. So Adam Smith, David Hume, and the Baron Montesquieu. And Smith and Hume are particularly interesting because in Scotland, there's hunter-gatherers in the north, there's pastoralists, and there were subsistence farmers in the southern part of Scotland is industrializing, right? It's the heart of the Industrial Revolution in some ways. Anyway, so they're getting to observe this process with all populations with very different amounts of market integration. And they ethnographically observe this same effect. Okay, so I've showed you a few different areas of psychology, including these three. I could have showed you evidence of universalistic moral foundations or evidence of the role of intentionality in moral judgment. I could have shown you stuff on analytic versus holistic thinking or the importance of guilt over shame. I could have talked about things like the endowment effect as well. All of these things vary across populations, And there's at least some evidence to think that varies in quality, that they can be explained by this differences in institutions rooted in kinship or markets or some of the other things I've discussed. A personality structure is an interesting one because new evidence suggests that more urbanized areas have personality structures that more fit the kind that psychologists talk about, that they've kind of unearthed as the 5-factor model, or the big 5 as they call it, that you find when you study Americans. So it could be that a lot of what we think of as personality structure is actually the personality structure of highly urbanized populations that have lots of occupational choice and ability to move among social niches, and then patients as well. Okay, so we kind of went over this, and since it's this group, I want to make sure I get to this innovation stuff. So in The Secret of Our Success, I made the case that one of the keys to the success of our species was our collective brains. So the fact that we're both cultural, we learn from others, and we're social, means that if you have larger and more interconnected groups, you're going to share more ideas, create more new recombinations, and you're going to innovate faster, and so you can get more and more ideas. So more and more innovations. So the case I make in the book is that this process that I've been laying out led to a lot of social changes, including urbanization, residential mobility, so the journeyman phase when craftsmen are being trained, it's not something you see elsewhere. Professional societies where people get together, swap ideas, strangers, and widespread literacy in books. All of these are going to lead to more sharing of information, more flow of ideas around Europe. It's going to energize innovation. And at a psychological level, the more trust you have, the more you're able to share ideas and work with others, work with strangers. Individualism and nonconformity leads people to be more open to new ideas and to want to set themselves apart and be unique by coming up with new ideas. Where if conformity is stronger and there's less individualism, then setting yourself apart by coming up with new ideas is not incentivized. Not interest in novelty, willingness to break with tradition. So it's kind of clear in the history of ideas that at some point people stop worrying about what Aristotle thought, or trying to figure out why the great sages didn't know this stuff. They realized that we're learning stuff that the great sages never knew about. And I emphasize the role of tolerance. So there's a couple of interesting cases. So one is that communities in Europe that didn't drive their Jewish populations out prospered more quickly. Philadelphia becomes very successful relative to Boston because of its rules about religious tolerance, which eventually make their way into the US Constitution. And I discuss this new and growing body of evidence showing that immigration has driven much of American ingenuity and innovation in the US because immigrants bring in new ideas, they recombine, and they make the natives more creative. And you can see that in patent data as well as in other sources.
But on that immigration point, think of a city like Boston, which would have had been ruled for several generations by a group which I would assume has a low kinship intensity index. And then you have the Irish immigration bringing in a group which I would assume has a higher kinship intensity index. So immigration that happens at sufficient scale can change the kind of the underlying composition of folks in a place. And my question then is, is the adaptation of the new group to the existing sets of social rules a given if it's occurring within a larger national context? If the immigration is large enough, can you then get what's the equivalent of regime change because you're bringing in a different set of Southern Italian traditions? So how do I think about that at either the city or national level?
Yeah, so with Max Winkler and Jonathan Schultz, we've been doing it. We've been gathering county-level network measures by using surnames, and we relate that to the patent database. And what we find is that there's no amount, the U.S. hasn't yet, at least at the aggregate level, hasn't experienced an amount of immigration that has any negative effects on innovation. So, so if you put a square term in for the amount of our kind of variation in last names, we don't get, it's never negative, right? So, I mean, that's just one measure of the kind of, we're using last names as a proxy. So we have this entropy measure of last names as a proxy of variation. And then we use some immigration waves as to get external variation in our last names to try to argue for causality. Yeah, and we don't see things there. But I mean, so in principle, you could have immigrations that, so clustering is probably bad if people cluster in the same place for too long. And of course, in principle, you could have something so large that it could shift the sort of, you know, the underlying social structure. But I just haven't seen a case where that's happened.
Some of the immigrant enclaves were big enough and long-lived enough that it seems like, following your logic, we should have seen differential paths of economic development at that kind of sub-regional level among northern Italian groups versus southern Italian groups, and then with all the additional variation that you just discussed. So then I take your argument to be that those things, they just aren't long-lived enough for those things to manifest themselves, or we just
Yeah, I mean, but that doesn't mean you couldn't. So, I mean, I think a nuanced enough analysis could probably pick that up. I mean, it's not like I think that immigration has always happened optimally. So, I'm imagining that you can find grist in the system where, you know, you create an enclave where there's slow assimilation, and it means you're not getting as much recombination of the incoming ideas as you would have. You also want variety of immigrants. So it's actually better to have more different immigrants from different places than to extract a whole bunch of immigrants from one place. I mean, based on the logic that I'm laying out here with the collective brain. So that's pretty much it for me. I just have some take-home messages, and then we can continue with questions. I mean, I guess my big take-home would be that we need to think of, I mean, there's this doctrine of psychic unity that has pervaded the social sciences, and we really need to think of minds as more malleable than that, and that our minds are adapting to the social worlds we confront, and that leads people to have different psychologies, and this can persist because cultural institutions persist, and cultural traits and norms persist, and that leads psychological traits to persist. And it affects the kinds of institutions we might build, how long we expect processes to take, and especially the current psychology of a population influences the kinds of institutions that will emerge next. So it seems important for understanding the evolution of institutions. That's all I have.